It's through the senses that we come to know the world. Oh, aha. Is it on? Okay, through the senses, we come to know the world and our experience within it. Our ways of sensing, however, are not neutral. Through processes of sensorial acculturation, we internalize and perpetuate the dominant norms of the cultural, social, and political systems that we're born into. Depending on context and location, these systems are made up of and sustained by imperialism, neoliberalism, cis and heterosexism, white supremacy, settler colonialism, the carceral state, etc. These intersecting systems are what Peruvian scholar Aníbal Quijano calls the colonial matrix of power. As sonic researchers grappling with our own positionalities in relation to the colonial matrix, we ask how coloniality delineates what and how we hear, and how might we listen otherwise.
The practice of undoing coloniality spans movements for anti-imperial sovereignty in colonized nations and indigenous calls for land back, as well as attempts to disrupt colonial impositions on ways of knowing and being in the world. Approaches to decolonization are diverse, often contested, and emerge from different histories. In our research practices, we engage the tangled intersections of decolonial theory emerging from a Latin American context, post-colonial scholarship emerging from European-centered postmodernism, and settler colonial studies, which center the ongoing repression of indigenous peoples and cultures. Some of the dissonances between these interconnected movements are heard in the words of indigenous scholars such as Eve Tuck, who with Wayne Yang calls out the metaphorization of decoloniality, a move that shirks accountability for the repatriation of indigenous land and life. Further, in the work of Bolivian feminist activist scholar Silvia Rivera Cusicuanchi, who cautions that Latin American decolonial scholars have simplified, commodified, and exported decolonial concepts that are tied to very local struggles.
Mindful of our own situated relations to coloniality, we'd like to take these 15 minutes to consider listening practices in relation to the colonial order. Here at the conference of the World Forum for Acoustic Ecology, situated on the ancestral lands of the Timucua, Mayaca, and Seminole peoples, in a state where all kinds of colonial reverberations of violence are evident, we consider what might it mean for us as settler sound scholars to unsettle the ways we connect with the complexities of place through listening. In thinking through this question, we draw from the work of two scholars who consider decoloniality in relation to aesthetics, sensory practice, and listening. Stolo scholar Dylan Robinson, who works in the context of Truth and Reconciliation era Canada, and Rolando Vasquez, whose work emerges from the Modernity Coloniality Group, a collective of Latin American scholars, including Arturo Escobar and Walter Mignolo, who highlight the omission of Latin American voices in dominant discourses of modernity.
The Modernity Coloniality Group sees coloniality as a structure of control that is inseparable from Western modernity. This is the worldview that universalizes the modern human subject, who experiences themselves as unitary, rather than made up of interpersonal and more than human relations, and as existing in what Vasquez calls the contemporary, rather than being shaped by ancestries and histories. This worldview is perpetuated through modernity's continual assertion of Eurocentric and anthropocentric understandings of the world, and importantly, the negation of other ways of knowing and being.
In the face of this, Vasquez offers listening as an orientation with the capacity to foster relationality, receptivity, and connection with one's location on the earth and in history. That said, as many scholars of late have pointed out, it's important to recognize listening as not de facto emancipatory.
In his 2020 publication, Hungry Listening, of which we've heard much this weekend, Robinson coins the term hungry listening to describe an extractive settler mode of perception. The term emerges from a Halkomelem word for white settlers, hulitum, which translates to starving person, referencing the hunger of early settlers for food and for gold. Towards dismantling this hunger, he advocates that settlers practice critical listening positionality, an allied form of listening that takes into account how our identities and histories affect what we can and cannot hear. Robinson's understanding of positionality is informed by both indigenous naming protocols and by Black feminist scholars. He also resonates here with Vasquez, who, in Vistas of Modernity, published in the same year, asserts that it is only from an awareness of our positioned realities that we can enter in relation with each other, that we can listen to each other and learn each other.
Robinson's call for settlers to work out their own listening strategies affirms and challenges our ongoing attempts to imagine what allied listening practices might mean within our respective contexts. This paper is part of that work. It also constitutes an emergent response to a moment in the conclusion of Hungry Listening, wherein Robinson invites two settler colleagues, Ellen Waterman and Deborah Wong, to process their responses to his book. In the course of their dialogue, they propose deep listening as a potential starting point for allied settler listening.
Deep listening is a creative practice developed by the late American composer and performer Pauline Oliveros that develops awareness of one's sonic environment, but also cultivates listening through the body, composition, improvisation, and dreams. As a longtime deep listener and as the current director of the Center for Deep Listening, I was excited to read this suggestion of deep listening as an allied practice. Robinson's response, however, was gently skeptical, saying, quote, "In my experience, the meditative opening up of listening through the body has also seemed to distance me from the particularity of listening positionality. This challenge is worth spending some time with. Are practices such as deep listening incompatible with the awareness of positionality that both Vasquez and Robinson call for?"
Hungry listening denotes extractivist sonic practices that are frantic, predatory, and harmful. An inverse of this approach might be listening through subtlety, humility, and stillness. This practice of quiet tuning in to the delicate filigree of sonorous worlds was also held dear by Pauline Oliveros, who famously asked us to walk so silently that the bottoms of our feet became ear. Aligned with the aims of feminist consciousness-raising groups of the 60s, deep listening was developed within the context of an exclusively female-identified research collective, with whom Oliveros workshopped collaborative scores that tune the listener into embodied rhythms of breath, listening, and response, resisting traditional musical hierarchies and the regimentation of linear clock time. Musical content emerges from participants' responses to each other, but also, crucially, to whatever and whomever it's possible to hear and sense. This is indeed, to use Robinson's words, an opening up of listening through the body, as sensory awareness is opened beyond the boundaries of the known self to both human and more than human others.
According to Ione, author, poet, director, and the longtime creative and life partner of Pauline Oliveros, these qualities of deep listening function, quote, beyond colonial mind. In my experience, deep listening practice in its attunement to sight and decentering of self-contained human subjectivity does have the capacity to unfix what Robinson calls settler listening fixations, opening cracks where wonder can come in. In this wonder, we hear whispers of what Vasquez calls the real, which is the pluriversality of ways of being and knowing beyond the colonial matrix. In this beyond, we experience connection with our surroundings, and we find that our surroundings have their own animacy and can meet us in relationship. This mode of experience is not without risk, however, and here we outline two.
The first risk is that we believe in the reality of this experience, arrogantly mistaking our experience for truth. The moment we universalize or try to hold on to our experience, we've inscribed our colonial sense of dominance, and the settler colonial sensorium is recentered. Another risk is that we forget that our perceptions are shaped by who, where, and how we are. As we enter into a state of receptivity to the environment, it's essential to remember the positionality that informs what we can and what we can't hear in the first place. Both of these risks can be described as forgetting our partial perspective. As science and technology studies scholar Donna Haraway reminds us, all knowledges are situated in their social, ecological, and historical relations.
How then might we address the friction between the experiential approach of opening up of listening through the body and the analytical approach of reflexive listening positionality? Pauline Oliveros often said in workshops that she didn't know what deep listening was, but that we should go ahead and create it together. Deep listening in this way is understood as a living practice continually shaped by all those who participate. In this spirit, contemporary artists informed by both deep listening and decolonial scholarship have offered scores that explore listening practices attuned to history, to place, and to listener positionality. Carcris Tagish First Nations curator Candace Hopkins and Diné American composer Raven Chacon's Dispatch calls for protection of land and was written in the context of the Dakota Access Pipeline protests at Standing Rock in 2016. Offered for publication as part of the Center for Deep Listening's 365-day publication project, their score names participants or players according to the complexities of their positionalities in relation to the land, their identities, and each other, before entering into a series of prompts, quote, of relation, of listening, of action, of witnessing, of performing.
While informed by the lineage of deep listening scores, Dispatch critically raises the stakes by engaging existential struggles for land protection and self-determination. Dispatch calls participant performers into an active negotiation of positionality in relation to land, whether as hosts, witnesses, artists, or temporary sympathizers, alongside attunement to the resonant harmonics and deep time of Standing Rock itself. In another work published by the Center for Deep Listening, sound scholar and deep listener Ellen Waterman proposes bodily listening in place as an improvisational practice that explores the sensory boundaries between self and other. Created in consultation with deaf artist collective Spill Propagation, Waterman's score is intended to develop, quote, a more expansive intersensory concept of listening beyond audition. Crucially, in Waterman's piece, we're instructed to spend up to a week simply tuning into our sensations in place before the work of the performance can even begin.
So, resisting the temptation to rush to an answer, we sit with the radical listening orientations of deep listening, with Robinson's call to critical listening positionality, and with Vasquez's propositions of listening as an access to the real. We dwell in the oscillations between the partial perspective of our own listening and the porous and transformative experience of attunement to sight. Listening to the work of Hopkins, Chacon, and Waterman, we consider the ways that embodied being in sight, sometimes slow and sometimes urgent, is necessary to begin the work of listening to our listening.
We invite you now to look around the room or the screen and notice all the other bodies in this space. How does it feel to be connected to this community of people that we are all part of in this room, in this Zoom room?
Notice the contact between your body and the chair, your clothes, your shoes, and everything that touches your skin. Notice the feeling of breath as it moves out of your body and in again.
Notice the sounds around us, near and far, and the precise moment that sound meets your body.
You can close your eyes here. Can you perceive a moment of connection between your body and the sounds you can hear? Where are you situated in relation to the sound around you and within you?
Can you expand your listening now to the resonances and dissonances of the partial perspectives of all the bodies that you're aware of, and of all the bodies that you're not aware of, microscopic, infinite, past, and future?
Come back to your own body now, situated in place. Listen with Rolando Vasquez for the murmurings of the real beyond the colonial order. Listen with Dylan Robinson for the ways your own ears are shaped by your unique identities and histories. Listen with Candace Hopkins and Raven Chacon for the rights of the land itself on which you are located. And listen for a whisper or a scream, for an invitation or a demand to respond. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
So how are you thinking about the difference between our theory of veracity, right, and our understanding of it as
Mm-hmm. So as I rephrase the question for Zoom, you can tell me if I have the question right. So the question is about this potential hiccup within deep listening or similar practices where you might take your experience to be reality. But how are we proposing that you can be careful about that while still honoring your own experience? Yeah. Yeah, so I think that's what we were sort of trying to get at in our kind of closing score. We've been kind of thinking and feeling around this for the last month or two. And one of the access points seemed to be just that continual remembering that it's partial. Everything that you're experiencing, it's the tiniest slice, and that doesn't make it any less real or meaningful. And it might be a different, tomorrow or in a moment, or for the ant, or for, and then another thing actually in Amanda's keynote, when she brought in the ultra red question of what do you hear? Actually, that seemed like a really useful sort of question that could be continually re-asked, like, what do you hear? What do you hear? What do you hear?
Yeah, and I think that's key, continually re-ask. So it has to be like every few seconds checked in again. What's changed? Because everything's changing all the time, right? So yeah.